everyone, and welcome back to our podcast.
This episode, we talked to Andy Moore, founder of Let's Fix This, an organization surrounding civic engagement. Dallas, what was your favorite part of this discussion?
My favorite part of this discussion was how he described responding to some politicians' statements or opinions about his work and organization and how he combats possibly false statements. How about you?
My favorite part was when he talked about how misinformation kind of interacts with and is involved with civic engagement and how that affects his organization and his employees and things like that.
We had a great time filming this episode, and we hope you enjoy it.
Welcome and thank you for joining us. We are so excited to talk to you. And we were wondering if you could start by describing your academic background and kind of leading into your professional background and now your organization.
Yeah, sure. So I'm Andy Moore. I'm the CEO of Let's Fix This, which is an Oklahoma-based organization, a nonprofit organization that promotes civic engagement, voting rights, and democracy more broadly. And I'm also the executive director of the National Association of Nonpartisan Reformers, which is essentially a trade association for the many groups around the country working on what we call electoral reform or democracy reform. So trying to win policy changes around open primaries, alternative voting methods like ranked choice voting, independent redistricting, campaign finance reform, vote by mail, things like that. Going back in time, a long ways, 20 years ago now, I went to college, went to Southern Nazarene University here in Oklahoma City with the intent of becoming a minister. I was a theology major to begin with. That changed relatively quickly in my freshman year, as it does for a lot of people. Ended up in psychology, and I got a bachelor's in psychology, and then followed immediately with a master's in counseling, and became a licensed professional counselor. I did private practice. I worked in community mental health. I did some state agency work for a number of years, and really enjoyed it. And most of my clients that I saw in private practice were individuals and couples, especially. I really enjoy doing couples counseling, and I did that for about 10 years. And like I said, really enjoyed it. Along the way, I took on full-time employment in addition to having a private practice, because it's tough getting started as a counselor. You got to build up a caseload, and I had bills to pay. And an opportunity kind of fell in my lap to work at the University of Oklahoma Health Sciences Center. I was the clinic administrator for their Infectious Diseases Institute, which sounds gross, and it's not. It's incredibly awesome. The infectious disease clinic at OU is the largest HIV treatment program in the state for people living with HIV and AIDS. We had a big mental health component, social work component, really wraparound services. And so I came in to supervise the mental health and social services, and then pretty quickly had my role expanded to oversee all of the operations of the clinic. Did that for about 10 years. And along the way, started getting involved in advocacy at the state level. And in 2016 is when we started Let's Fix This. And then in 2019, I left OU because I had an opportunity to run an initiative petition campaign for a statewide ballot initiative, like a state question, for independent redistricting. So I left OU to go run that campaign, and that we weren't able to make the ballot because the COVID-19 pandemic happened right when we were getting ready to start collecting signatures. And if you remember, in the spring of 2020 in summer, nobody would open their door. Like, we were all on lockdown, and it was very impossible to collect signatures. And in fact, for a good part of the time, the state put a stop on it. We weren't allowed to collect signatures. So We ended up missing the ballot for 2020 and still talking about it. There's always another opportunity, right? As we get nearer to the 2030 census and people begin to talk about redistricting again. But from that, it's kind of when I really made this shift into working in public policy and advocacy full time.
Thank you for sharing. My question for you is, through your professional and educational background that you just described, were you taught about misinformation and or disinformation and how to detect it?
Yeah, it's a good question. Not really. I mean, there's always webinars and stuff about it, and I know a number of folks who kind of work in those fields and have talked to them about it. Most of the time, I think I've been a supervisor, and so there's like little ways that this has come about, even 15 years ago, trying to train my staff of what was misleading online and what to click on and what not to click on. That had more to do with like computer viruses and Trojan horse hacks and that kind of things. We really didn't start seeing, mass amounts of disinformation and misinformation until like the 2016 election cycle. And since then, which I know is 8 years ago, it feels like it wasn't that long ago, but that's certainly been a huge increase. And especially through a lot of the work with the with election reform nationwide. Anything now, it's real tough to kind of cut through the confusion out there and just the sheer quantity of information that's available. And I think it's harder and harder for people to try to parse out what is good and accurate and safe and truthful versus what's entertainment or what is actual like disinformation. When Let's Fix This started in 2016, it really was made possible by Twitter and the culture of Twitter at the time, particularly here in Oklahoma, where it was a really collegial environment, which sounds crazy now to say, but like at the time, we really had a pretty good group of folks who were on it. Were a lot of advocacy folks, a lot of public policy, a lot of public relations, a lot of journalists, just a lot of regular folks who were on Twitter and Facebook to a lesser degree. And so we had a lot of like actual interpersonal relationships and conversation. That same environment is not the case now. We would not have been able to get started in today's world because a lot of the social media platforms are just so, I think, inundated with noise that it makes it really hard to kind of get anything going.
Yeah, I definitely think it's interesting to think about the progression of and the role that social media has played and how that's changed over time. But kind of through this, your organization, which is very like civic minded, has misinformation affected you in that, or you in general, directly or indirectly?
Yeah, it hasn't really affected us, I think, like in a bad way. I think the amount of disinformation and misinformation that's out there is something we think a lot about, particularly when it comes to educating people on how to vote, right? Like I'm very conscientious if we do videos about how to vote by mail or even how to vote in person, that we want to be above reproach, and we're not trying to dumb it down for anybody. We're trying to be exact in the information to make sure that we are a reputable source of information, and still presented in a way that's accessible to people. And our state election officials do an excellent job of this as well. Heck, just this week, the state election board kicked out a couple of county election board members because they had been really casting a lot of doubt on the security of our elections in this state, which is absurd. And we have like the gold standard in the country, and they, I think, had really hit a wall of like, listen, we just can't entertain this anymore. We have to like draw a bright line here. And I think that's good for our elections in this state, and that's good for democracy across the country. So when you have elections officials that take their job seriously, as almost all of them do. Like I know a lot of elections officials around the country, and they are tremendous assets to democracy. And I think for organizations like mine, we have an obligation, responsibility to make sure that we are providing sound, accurate information always, because we are then going to be contrasted with the amount of fake news that's out there, and you have to like maintain that high level of professionalism at all times to make sure you can't like take the easy route and like take a cheap political hit at somebody. You have to do the right thing in order to maintain that relationship.
Thank you. You mentioned earlier how, in general, there's mass amounts of information, fake and real, on social media. Do you think that in your profession specifically, or in the field of advocacy as a whole, or in any way you would like to take this question, has there been an increase in both misinformation and disinformation? And if so, how would you go about mitigating their effects?
Yes. The answer is yes. It's obviously increased. I think we all see it all the time, especially, even in the last year, right? Like the advent of generative AI hitting the mainstream is making things, making all of us, I think, question the authenticity of a lot of stuff online, which is scary. It's really disconcerting, right? When you see a video and you're like, wait, is this fake? Like what if this is fake? And I tried to use AI a couple of years ago to write some like bios to like introduce some speakers at a conference, and I was like, oh, maybe this will save time, and so I had it do it. But then when I had my colleague fact check it, it was full of like very open errors, telling they worked places they didn't work, and I was like, oh man, like I think it was well worded, it seemed correct, it like felt professional, and you're like, oh, I had no idea they worked there. Well, it's because they didn't. And it was like, oh, we could have very easily slipped into this trap, right? It's not trap, but we could have slipped into providing or sharing misinformation unintentionally, and that's, I think, a big risk. I think when it comes to news in particular, we as people, as consumers of the news, have to be more diligent in understanding the source from where we're getting news. And I think there's an enormous amount of pressure on journalists to be accurate, and to be correct on these things. So, big, stable news outlets, right? Like all the big networks of ABC and NBC and CBS, and in some cases, right, the other cable derivatives there. But I think there's some websites or some nonprofits that like kind of fact check the news broadly and rate news outlets on how partisan they are and how reputable they are. And I think we see this trend of like the more partisan, the greater the chance that information is going to be incorrect, right, or misrepresented. And so really trying to make sure that we are consuming media from reputable sources, and approach everything with both a curiosity and a degree of skepticism, right? That we want to like verify this, and so not just getting our news from a single source, right? Like not just reading the Times, not just watching Fox News, whatever it is, but like make sure that we're kind of checking this across other places. There's some really cool websites that have started to kind of help with this. A couple that I work with, one is called All Sides, that really tries to present information from all sides, right? They will take a story and present it from the left and the right, from reputable news sources, so that you as a consumer can read the two slants on it with this understanding that the truth is somewhere in the middle. There's sites like that I think are really helping and can be helpful in doing that, and sharing that information in a way that paints a fuller picture, a more accurate picture.
Yeah, absolutely. It is definitely very important to be aware of where you're consuming your news and also trying to like diversify it more. Kind of in the field of like civic engagement and with your organization, have you seen that disinformation is has impacted people's view of civic engagement and of your organization's work? And has there been any instances where your organizations had to address the misconceptions or false information about the civic engagement, especially?
Yeah, I mean, I think yes, but it's not so much like malicious disinformation as it is like, I don't know, the increasingly like partisanized world we live in, right? So I've had elected officials make claims that we're, a liberal organization or a right-wing company. Like, both it's happened on some days, like people have been mad we lean too far one way or the other, and it just means we are not leaning their direction. We try very hard to stay, I think, in the middle. Um, when I was doing the ballot campaign in 2019, the elected officials that are in power here in the state, said things like this is nothing more than a liberal coup, right? That these are outsiders and which is ridiculous because we were trying to combat gerrymandering, which is not partisan. It's about power, right? Republicans in Oklahoma don't wanted to maintain their ability to gerrymander in the same way that Democrats in Illinois wanted to maintain their ability to gerrymander. And we see it across the country from both parties. And some will say, well, that's just politics. And maybe it is, right? But that was in, December of 2019. And then or December of 2020. And then, you see on like January 6th of 2021, right? Like there was a actual coup that occurred, right? Or attempted coup at the US Capitol. And so suddenly what used to be dismissed as just political rhetoric or like that's just politics takes on a different tone, right? When people are breaking into the nation's capital. And so I think, those kind of things are a good reminder that people need to like dial back the rhetoric and we're not stop trying to like just score points all the time. I know that's what makes the world go round in politics, but when it comes to, I don't know, voting, right? Like, shouldn't everyone be allowed to vote? Every eligible voter should be allowed to vote. And if we all believe that, then we should do everything we can to make it as easy and accessible for legally eligible voters to vote. Too often what happens is the flip side, but I think if we really can sit down eyeball to eyeball and boil it down to understand where we're at, we probably agree on a lot more than we would admit publicly. And if there's agreement there, I think there's less opportunity for some of the disinformation. So I don't enjoy, like, I haven't seen anything that's been directed at us other than trying to like be dismissive. And hopefully, right, we are diligent about trying to keep up our reputation and our relationships in the community so that anytime that if that ever did come up, it would be pretty easily dismissed from the beginning. I'm not aware of any like deep fake videos of myself on the internet, if that's what you're asking.
Thank you for sharing. My next question is, it kind of relates to the previous one. In your role, how do you ensure that your team, your colleagues are well equipped to understand and spot misinformation and also deal with it if you come across it?
Yeah, I mean, I think I work with some pretty smart, intuitive people, so I'm fortunate in that way, that are discerning and thoughtful about what they consume, how much they consume, and from where they consume it. The platforms, the news outlets. Last year, we host an annual event called Civics Con, right? It's like a civics convention, and we had a session or two sessions about disinformation and misinformation from some public relations and communication specialists to really talk about this, because especially in the media, it's getting harder. And if someone just happens to log into Facebook or whatever and see a quote article from some website, if they don't know who that is, I'm like, just don't even read it. Just dismiss it if you're not sure, right? Like really got to fact check some things. And so we try to raise it up, and even this conversation is a good reminder to me that we could do a better job of kind of baking that into the ethos of what we're trying to communicate, to help the public, help voters, help our colleagues make sure that we are staying sharp and avoiding that kind of stuff.
Yeah, thank you. I really think it's important for people of all professions to really know how to consume news, especially if they're in such a position that it relates to public affairs and things like that. But yeah, thank you so much for being on. We really appreciate it. We loved this discussion and being able to talk about how disinformation affects you and how misinformation ties into, what you're doing. But yeah, thank you so
Yes,
much.
thank you so much.
Of course, thanks for having me.